Good afternoon, and thank you, Daniel, for the welcome. We've been on quite a journey so far. Two important topics that we dealt in our first two sessions. The first one on the power of the mind, and the second one on nutrition. Today is, I think, a very vital topic on detoxing our world. But before I start into the topic, I actually want to review some of the material that we covered in our very first session. And you may remember that we spoke about the question, we asked the question, what is health? And in that we recognise that health isn't just the physical, because so often that's what we immediately think of when the topic of health comes up, but it also includes the mental, the social, and also the spiritual. So these elements work together to bring us what we could label total health. We also posed another question, that is, what is the purpose of health? Now, some of that seems fairly self-evident, but I think there's a broader aspect to health as well. Clearly optimal functioning is one of those. Wellness is there. But interestingly, longevity. And there's people who actually want to have not only good health for the present, but they want to live longer. And we discussed how there are some futurists who believe that with medical advances, if we keep ourselves healthy, then lifespans could increase quite significantly over the next few decades. The capacity to contribute is also something which can be derived from good health. In actual fact, I think that's one of the purposes of health. We all want to make a difference in the world and a difference in life. And then the idea of pursuing meaning, because we aren't just physical organisms that exist for a period of time, we live and then we die. There's actually a lot more to it, and this idea of what the meaning of life is and what our part is in meaning, I think, is a very important question, and I think that comes under the important question of the purpose of health. So I think that is important to place some background and at least some perspective on some of the discussion which we're obviously going to have today. And today's topic is detoxing our world. Now, there's no prizes for knowing that the world is filled with toxins and chemicals. In fact, it's been suggested that in the last century, there have been millions, in fact over 1 million, in fact several million new chemicals which have been artificially manufactured and released into the environment. Every year there are many thousands of new chemicals. The problem is that most of those aren't tested for safety in humans, and what's more is our bodies need to somehow deal with them as they're exposed, because those chemicals in many cases will get into our bodies and our bodies have to process them and eliminate them so we don't actually become sick. Can someone actually, well, as a group, can you think of some of the types of chemicals or some of the groups of chemicals that perhaps are toxic to us which we may encounter in our environments?
DDT.
Okay, DDT, so some of the pesticides, yeah? Lead? Plastics, yeah. Arsenic? I've heard a few more. What? Asbestos? Mercury, okay, yeah. Yeah, petrochemicals? Smoking, yes, so cigarette smoke and some of the toxins in that. Yeah. Formaldehyde, yeah. Okay, so some of the chemicals in various cleaning products, in fact, indeed in a lot of household products. Yeah, there's a lot of synthetic artificial chemicals in those. Sodium lauryl sulfate, yeah, in some of the shampoos, etc. Yeah, artificial colourings and flavourings and various additives that we have in our foods. Heavy metals, yeah, which various, mercury has been mentioned, but things like lead and cadmium, etc. There are many.
Propylene glycol.
Okay, propylene glycol. Yeah, there's...
Face cream.
And that's the thing, and that's something that if we get a chance we can comment on, because there are things we put in our skin which are absorbed through our skin and our bodies have to deal with them. Aspartame, yeah. So some of the artificial sweeteners, etc., can be a toxin as well. Our bodies have to deal with them. So we could probably spend the next 20 minutes going through and listing a whole range of different toxins. But I think what is clear is that there are many and varied different sources of toxicity that we come in contact with. Now, the problem is that these things cause problems to our body. Now, we know that in each one of them, given in sufficient quantity, is going to cause illness and disease. The problem is what happens is if we're exposed to just small amounts at a time. Now, in some cases, our bodies can deal with it. Now, we have some pretty good detoxing systems already in our bodies, and they can, when there's small-scale pollution or small-scale toxicity, our bodies can actually deal with that, and we have mechanisms to eliminate those toxins. The problem is when we are bombarded on a daily basis by many thousands of these chemicals, it gets to the stage where for many people, in fact I would suggest probably most people, the systems are overwhelmed. And we accumulate those toxins in the body, particularly in the fatty tissues. And so there will be many decades of exposure. And the thing is that people, kids when they're teenagers, even young people in their 20s and 30s, tend not to actually have too many health problems. What happens? But when people get into their 40s, their 50s and 60s, health problems accelerate. And the interesting thing is that during those decades, we are slowly accumulating more and more toxins. And so there are some commentators who will look at this, some of the people in the health professions will look at this and think, well, hey, it's in our 50s and our 60s that we reach a threshold of toxicity which can cause multiple different health problems. Now, what are some of the detox pathways that our bodies have? Normally, how do our bodies deal with toxins that come into them? Okay, the liver, yes. So some people have said the liver. Absolutely, liver is very important in detoxification. Any other things? And we'll talk more about the liver in a moment.
Is the body flushed with water?
Yeah, so water can be useful. It flushes them out through the kidneys, absolutely. Lymph nodes, yeah. The lymphatic system is important because it can then be the system which carries a lot of the toxins away from the cells and can help dispose of them. Lymphatic's very important. The lungs, yeah, absolutely. We can actually exhale some toxicity, and some of the vapours and gases can actually be eliminated that way. Which one? Perspiration. Look, and we'll come to that too. Perspiration actually is a very important mechanism that the body uses in order to rid itself of various wastes. So, yes?
We just need to ask, how does alcohol detoxifies the liver?
Oh, the question is how alcohol makes the liver toxic. Multiple mechanisms. Alcohol needs to be, and I'll just answer it quickly, but yeah, look, it's a good question to do with alcohol and toxicity. First of all, it breaks down into an intermediate product, aldehyde, which can actually be quite toxic in its own right. The way it does it, it actually can interfere with DNA repair. It decreases glutathione in the liver, which is important antioxidant. It increases some of the irregular collagen formation, which can lead to fibrosis in the liver as well as being a toxin in its own right. So I guess the short of it is alcohol works at multiple levels to cause a lot of damage. The other interesting thing is it sequesters nutrients in order to activate so the enzymes and substances required to detoxify the alcohol actually use up other important nutrients, and in many cases the body doesn't have spare in reserve. So, sorry, that's probably a short answer, but it's a partial answer. So toxins and chemicals there. So we've come up with the different pathways of detox. What I want to concentrate, I guess, a little bit more is the role of the liver. Because the liver is fairly fundamental to it all. See, what happens with the liver is most toxins arrive at the liver and the liver has to process them. And there are two phases of detoxification. Many of you may have heard of it. There's phase 1 detoxification, where the toxin is transformed to what we call an intermediate. Now, the problem with the intermediate is, in some cases, in fact in many cases, it's even more toxic than the original toxin. So what we need is to quickly go on to phase 2, which then completely detoxifies it and puts it in a form which the body can eliminate it, either through the motions or through the kidneys. So we really need to look at phase 1 and phase 2 in terms of the detoxification in the liver. Now, the thing is, in order for these processes to work properly, they need to have the right enzymes, they need to have the right nutrients. Now, interestingly, in phase 1, you need to have things like zinc and magnesium, molybdenum, etc., etc. There are these cofactors which are required so that the enzymes are able to do their job. But then you get to the phase 2, and this is where glutathione is one of the major substances that is required. You may have heard of glutathione. Some people label it as the master antioxidant in the body. And if that's depleted, then we can have a problem because we build up more of those intermediates which actually can do other damage along the way. So we want to make sure that our phase 2 is working very well. And so glutathione is one of those substances. And glutathione can be supported by a range of different nutrients. Anything from some of the vitamins can be quite important there. Things like N-acetylcysteine, lipoic acid. You may have heard of some of the herbs that can be used to support the liver. Things like milk thistle, the silymarin. These are some of the substances that can actually boost the production of glutathione and support the liver in its detoxification. So the liver is very important. I'll make one point about one substance that we generally think is quite benign, but what we're finding out more and more, it may not be as benign as we thought. We're all familiar with Panadol, with paracetamol. Now, often used for headaches, for pain, even for chronic pain, etc. What I understood, I guess, early on, and those who have worked in emergency departments, if someone overdoses, and let's say it takes too many tablets of paracetamol, they will be in a lot of trouble. In fact, they can die from liver poisoning, from liver toxicity. And the way it does that is overwhelm the phase 2 detoxification. It basically uses up the body's glutathione production. And so the treatment in an emergency department is to give intravenously this substance called N-acetylcysteine, the NAC, which I mentioned before, can be used to support the liver. Now, that is done in an acute toxic situation. But what happens if someone's ingesting it long term, over time? Well, what we do know is that it is going to use some of the reserve of the glutathione. Now, it's not going to be enough to overwhelm it and cause massive liver damage acutely, but the point is it's still going to decrease the detox capacity of the liver because it's using up some of that glutathione. And what we're finding out more about paracetamol now is that it can have an impact on the mitochondrial membrane. Now, you may remember the mitochondria are the energy factories in each one of our cells. And so if we decrease somehow their functioning, it means that we can become more tired, more lethargic. And so maybe paracetamol isn't quite the benign compound that we have thought for so often. But what's clear is that the liver is very important and we do want to support it. Now, what are some of the things we can do to decrease our exposure to toxins? And we've commented on, as a group, we've come up with a range of toxins that are in the environment, but I want to go through some specific ones. The first two I'm not going to spend too much time on. In fact, we've already commented on alcohol and we've commented on some of the issues. But I think as a society we've well come to, we've accepted that alcohol and cigarette smoke certainly are toxins and ideally are eliminated. In fact, there are massive government campaigns in order to try to deal with these major public health issues. Cigarette smoke, for example, has hundreds of toxic substances and dozens of which are known carcinogens. And the thing is, I think most of the adult population is very aware of the toxic nature of cigarette smoke. And in fact, most people who are smokers have at some stage or another tried to quit. The problem is it's very addictive. And so people find it awfully difficult in many cases to try to quit. It's not that the majority don't want to, I think they do. But for many it's very difficult. So of course the best thing and particularly for young people is to never start. Next thing is we've got drugs. Now, when we say drugs, we immediately think of, I guess, illicit drugs, and they are certainly a problem in society today. But there's also the non-illicit drugs when you look at a lot of the substances that we can buy. Sometimes they're in supermarkets or pharmacies over the counter, as we've just spoken about, paracetamol. But there's also some of the prescription items as well. And in the type of medicine that I practice, what I notice is that there are many people who are on various prescription medications. But the problem is that there are often side effects on prescription medications. And what can be done, ideally, is that we look at other alternatives, if possible, that can sometimes substitute for some of these things. So, for example, there are many people who are on blood pressure medication because people often get blood pressure as they get older. Now, there's an interesting, question as to why. In fact, when I was going through medical school, they categorised hypertension in different categories. Now, the largest category, which comprised 95% of hypertension, was what they called essential hypertension. Interesting label. It just simply really meant that it's hypertension. We don't know why. Various people have come up with different theories, but look, amongst others, some have suggested that increased toxicity that has accumulated over many decades could actually be one of the things that plays a role to increase blood pressure. But there are others. There are, for example, I have had good effect with some patients, just something as simple as magnesium we know, can lower blood pressure in some people. I'm not suggesting that for everybody, but these are some of the other possibilities there. The other point I should make at this stage is, as I'm talking about some of these things, the material is of a general nature, and for your specific situation, of course, speak with an appropriate health professional before, I guess, going too deep into some of the dosages and some of the protocols I may mention in passing. So drugs are a very interesting one, and so what we do want to do is to be at least aware that anything which is artificial or synthetic can, in some cases, have a positive effect, as with some prescription drugs, but there can be side effects as well, and I think we're well familiar with that. The next thing is air pollution. In this part of the world, actually, we're fairly blessed. It's not as bad as in some parts of the world. The sea breezes can be quite good, and they can be quite cleansing. The problem is that there are other forms of air pollution as well, and particularly within buildings. We've probably heard of sick building syndrome, sometimes that can be from maybe moulds or fungi. Sometimes it can be from various off-gassing of various furniture or upholstery, etc. The new car smell that you smell. The problem is that that's actually volatile organic compounds which are being released, and for some people they can actually be quite a problem, and they can contribute to toxicity. And the thing is, yes, they can actually gradually accumulate and be stored in the fatty tissue. Also, when I'm not sure if you've laid new carpet, and sometimes the cheap carpet, I remember some time ago we were renting a place and the landlords decided to put in new carpet. Why? Because there was mould damage because water had got in. And the carpet, I'm sure it was the cheapest possible carpet available, the cheapest plastic, nylon, whatever it was, and we couldn't really go into the room for 3 months because it actually completely, it was an overwhelming smell of that new carpet. Now the thing is, what we know from say carpets, from various upholstery, furniture, those smells which are released can accumulate in toxicity. So what's nice is to allow the house at least to air as much as possible and to try to decrease the exposure to those. The next one is heavy metals, which were mentioned as well. Things like mercury or lead or cadmium, aluminium, etc. Aluminium we've known about for quite some time. A few decades ago there was a link between aluminium and Alzheimer's. Another interesting one is mercury, actually. Mercury we're often exposed to in some of the foods that we eat, but also the amalgam that many people have in their mouths can slowly leak mercury. Now I guess the official word is that they're considered to be safe, although it's interesting that they have been banned in some countries in the world, particularly in Scandinavia and some other countries in Europe. Because what we do know is that they do leak or leach out about between 5 and 20 micrograms per day for each amalgam. Now the thing is, for many people that's going to be absolutely fine because they may have the detox systems in place that can cope with that, but there are some people who can't. I remember one patient who I saw 2 years ago, and I saw her when she was actually very advanced in being unwell. She had lost 15 kilos in 5 months. She had no energy. She had major headaches. A whole list of symptoms as long as your arm. And she had been to the hospital. I mean, it seems that everybody had investigated her and there was no cause. Everyone thought she had cancer. Her work colleagues thought she was about to die. And so on questioning, I found out, hey, well look, she had chipped a tooth and she had a raw exposed mercury amalgam. And so I suggested, well look, you really want to take that out. And sure enough, she did. And the next time I saw her, the history came out. Within 24 hours of having that leaking amalgam taken out, all her symptoms disappeared, every single one of them. And so she got her appetite back, she didn't have her appetite, she had put on 2.5 kilos in the last week, her colour had come back, she was actually in colour as opposed to black and white and grey, and things had changed. And so that is an example of, I guess, an environmental toxin which just happened to be in her mouth. And because of the crack or the break in a tooth, it was exposed, it was raw, and it was causing her symptoms. So heavy metals are one of those important things. Now, the next one is plastics. That was mentioned as well. Now, the problem, maybe someone here knows, what is the problem with plastics, or at least one of the major problems with having plastics? Yeah? Yeah, exactly right. The thing is with plastics is they mimic the effect of estrogens, the hormone estrogen in the body. And for many people, that can cause a whole raft of problems in both men and in women. And the problem is that, and here, look, the problem is it can be something as simple as, the plastic water bottles can leak out. In fact, what's worse is if those keep being refilled because each time they tend to leak a little bit more. But then we often have plastic containers, which by themselves may be a little bit bad, but then if we microwave food and heat it up, in a plastic container, then sometimes that can cause even more problem because it actually, with the heat, can cause more of the plastic to come out. So we just need to be, I think, aware of the plastic exposure that we have with our food, because there's no question, as you quite rightly pointed out, that they can mimic the effects of estrogen in the body. And so that's best to decrease our exposure to those. Mould, which I have mentioned briefly, but mould, there's another patient I can mention who came in, a lot of headaches, a lot of just feeling very tired, run down, not able to focus, not able to concentrate. And we went through the usual things, couldn't find anything. In fact, she went to one of the doctors in Brisbane to see, well, look, maybe there were some clues there, and that didn't seem to help. There was nothing that would help. And then it came out on further questioning when we spoke about it. Whenever she went away for the weekend, she felt better. It came out that she was renting a room, underneath the house, and it was all full of mould. And whenever she went away, she felt better. Whenever she came back, she felt worse. In the end, there was no option. She moved house. And, you guessed it, she felt a lot better. So mould is one of those issues that we don't often think about, but it can make us very sick. So there's anybody here who has a room downstairs or has mould exposure, just be aware of it, because it can actually make you quite unwell. Next one is pesticides. Now, pesticides are fascinating things because they can accumulate over many decades in the body, and we're exposed to them a lot. In fact, what's the purpose of pesticides? The purpose of pesticides is to kill things that are living. Well, that's interesting. Well, they just usually happen to be very little things, and so you don't need a huge dose and they die. But it seems to be okay that we can ingest it over many decades, and that's the point. It's not going to hurt us a lot for a year, for 2, for 5 years usually. But if we have increasing exposure that accumulates, it can actually have a toxic effect in our bodies. What's interesting is that medical researchers, when they want to, let's say for example they want to do research on cancer or some sort of neurological diseases, What they'll often do is to give a high dose of pesticide to the rats, for example, to induce those cancers. What is interesting though is with those, there have also been experiments done where they have tried to induce those cancers with the pesticides, but also given glutathione. Remember, we spoke about glutathione as being something that protects the liver in phase 2 detoxification. When they gave the glutathione at the same time as the pesticides, the rats didn't get cancer. It's very interesting. But pesticides are something which is good to avoid too. Toxic food. Oh, we could. Look, we spoke a bit about that last week, but some of the foods. Well, okay. Obviously, things like trans fats we dealt with last week. They are denatured fats which have the wrong three-dimensional configuration. When they get into the body, they actually wreak havoc as opposed to being good for our structural integrity of our cells. I think we covered toxic food probably enough last week, and we did cover sugar a little bit as well. Sugar, what's the problem with sugar? Do you remember, well, at least one or two of the problems with sugar that we mentioned last week? Yeah, well, that's true. Well, look, certainly it can promote weight gain, no question. Any of the other things that it does? Sorry, what's that? Well, absolutely. It has a role in diabetes, of course, and our body has to process it, which puts an extra strain on our body. Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's interesting. In fact, some have argued that sugar is more addictive than heroin. Yeah. So sugar can be a real issue. But the other thing is that sugar is very involved with is as a product of its metabolism, and in fact the way it's used in the body, it promotes inflammation. We know that inflammation is one of the common mechanisms in pretty much every chronic degenerative disease. So if we minimise our sugar, we're doing ourselves a great service in terms of our health and particularly our chronic health issues. And then there's negative emotions. You may remember back to the first session where we spoke about the epigenetics of emotion. So that if we have the good emotions, then it does good things to our genes. So we will have the good genes which will be switched on and the bad ones will be switched off. But the reverse is if we have negative emotions, things like jealousy, envy, anger, etc., then that will have an impact on the expression of our genes, and it will be that our bad genes will be expressed and our good ones will be switched off. So negative emotions are actually toxic to our body. And I think that's really worthwhile to re-emphasise back to the material that we covered in our first session. Now, that's a list of some of the major toxins, and these are some of the things that we want to decrease. But what I want to do is look at the flip side of that. It's one thing to decrease them, but clearly we can't eliminate them. We're still going to have some exposure to them. So what are the things that we can do to detox from what we already have and also to strengthen our defences so that we can cope with those insults that we have? So let's run through some in just a little bit of time that we have left. Well, the first one is we want to have fresh air. Now, why is fresh air important? Yeah, well, that's the thing. The oxygen is very important because it's with the oxygenation of our body that our cells can actually work optimally. If we're getting poor quality air and we're not getting enough oxygen, then we're not going to have the cells working well to be able to detox. So fresh air is important. Now, this is where sometimes, well, look, it's great being outdoors here, but the issue is indoors sometimes, and that's where, trying to ventilate as much as possible. Look, in some cases, people may even buy air purifiers. And I know in one place that we lived in, we actually had to buy an air purifier because of some issues there. And that is another thing that sometimes can be useful if you can't do too much about the air quality of the room that you're in. Next one is sunshine. How does sunshine improve our detox systems?
Vitamin D.
Yeah, vitamin D, and that's it. Even in a place like this which receives so much sunshine, you wouldn't believe how many people are low in vitamin D. And vitamin D, we know, has a major impact on our immune system, and a lot of autoimmunity may have some association, or at least be worsened by low vitamin D levels. vitamin D is critical for being able to have our bodies work effectively in all of this. Next one is exercise activity. Now in our next session we're going to speak a lot more about exercise and activity, but just the few points which I will make about it is that as we're active we are mobilising more oxygen because we've got to breathe harder, so more oxygen goes into the system. We also, with our muscle contractions, stimulate the cells to eliminate waste much more effectively. And it is through exercise and activity, movement of muscles, that the lymphatics are able to drain. If we just sit all day, our lymphatics don't move and we accumulate the toxins. If we move, then basically the toxins will go through and they'll be eliminated much more effectively. The next one is sweat. Someone mentioned sweat before, and I think it's a really important one. And I've put there, for example, sauna. There's a particular type of sauna that I really quite like. It's called the far infrared sauna. Has anybody heard of a far infrared sauna? Yeah, so no, a number of you have. Now, the principle of a far infrared sauna is that it doesn't go to 80, 90, 100 degrees Celsius. It often does its work around 50 or 60 degrees, so it's actually not uncomfortable. But it has the far infrared rays, if you remember the electromagnetic spectrum, and they're at a particular wavelength that stimulates the cells of the body to sweat. And it penetrates, it's basically a room that you sit in, a little cabinet, and it makes the cells up to about 2 centimetres, 2.5 centimetres into the body. It mobilises those cells to sweat and to heats them up. And interestingly, the fat cells then are able to metabolise. In many cases, they actually will release their toxic contents, which then the body can process. It can either be sweated out, or the immune system in the body can actually deal with those toxins. It's interesting how that has been used with some of the toxic issues. You may remember there was a major incident in Chile where miners were trapped, and many of them were exposed. In fact, they were exposed to all this toxicity. Well, those who had I think it was a 3 or 4 week intensive far infrared sauna therapy, where every day they would spend in the sauna. I'm not sure exactly how long they spent, but they were able to detoxify and had a much better health outcome. Similarly, firefighters in New York, when the Twin Towers collapsed, many of them were exposed to toxic chemicals. And those who went through a sauna protocol to detox found that their health improved much more quickly than those who didn't go through it. In fact, this is not a new idea. This was around in the 70s, where there were some clinics who used this in order to detoxify from hard drugs. See, it's one thing to get the initial clean out, but the other thing is a lot of the residues of drugs have accumulated and of course are stored in the fatty tissue. And what they found was that when they went through the sauna process, yes, there were times where there were some release of some of these chemicals, and there was maybe a little bit more of a, I guess, reminder and a little bit more of a trip, so to speak, but then it cleared out very quickly, and so the physiological dependence was able to be addressed in a fairly quick period of time, and many people found it very effective for detox. So the sweat angle is very interesting, and when you consider that over many decades people will accumulate toxins in their fatty tissues, it can well be that something like a regular infrared sauna can be very useful in dealing with those accumulated toxins over many years. I've had patients, for example, who have had some very high blood pressure. They've gone into and done the sauna therapy, and they've found that their blood pressure is much better controlled after that. And there's various other examples I could give you, but it's a really interesting idea. If you do want to pursue that, I'd suggest obviously finding out more about that, because there are some various protocols. You've obviously got to drink enough fluids to replace that which is sweated out. There needs to be replacement of some of the electrolytes and salts. And also there are some support nutrients. But it can be a very effective method of detox. The next one is water. Water we've spoken about last week, but unless you are well hydrated, then the wastes really don't eliminate anywhere near as well. And so having enough water is good. And here I would emphasise pure water, because sometimes the sources of water we have, particularly if we live in older houses, maybe with copper pipes or some of the plastics and some of the materials which may not be as great, You know, it's usually useful to put some sort of water filter in the house and filter the water to make sure that it's pure. Then nutrition, we have touched on last week, but what we want to do, one of the important things in nutrition is not to overeat. Because if we eat too much, then our body has to deal with it, and the bit that we overeat with is actually a toxin in its own way because it's surplus to requirements. And so our body has to process it, and that is a toxin. And as I mentioned last time, there are some people actually find the whole notion of intermittent fasting to be something which is quite helpful. Some people will fast for religious reasons as well, and if they do so, interestingly, there are health benefits which come from that as well. But the whole idea of nutrition and perhaps even distancing ourselves from some of the caloric intake for a time can be something worthwhile as a detox strategy. Supplements. Supplements are a huge issue. For many people, many people don't actually have enough of the nutrients. What I find, for example, many people are low in magnesium, many people are low in zinc. As I read, there are some commentators who argue that even 70 or up to 80% of the population may be low in those nutrients. Interestingly, those nutrients are required for the detoxification in the liver. In fact, in the case of magnesium, magnesium is required for 300 different activities in the body. Zinc for 200 different activities in the body. These are very important nutrients, but many people are low in them. Now, what about some of the other ones I mentioned, say for the liver? Things like N-acetylcysteine, perhaps R-alpha lipoic acid, the milk thistle, the silymarin. These are things which can boost the liver. These are things which can boost the detox as well. Selenium is something we tend not to have very much in our soil. Selenium can be very useful for detoxification. So can vitamin C. One of the forms of vitamin C some people find very useful is liposomal vitamin C, which actually can be absorbed much more readily than the usual vitamin C and can target the cells actually very effectively. So these are some of the supplements that can be quite useful. In fact, one other one that comes to mind, iodine, is one that many people are deficient in. We know now that iodine is very important for infant health, for neonatal health, for brain development, for IQ in very young kids. But in adults as well, iodine is required for thyroid function. And many people, I've tested a lot of people, and many people are very low in iodine. And one of the things contributing to that is iodine is displaced by things like fluoride and chlorine and bromide, etc., which we find in our environment. And so even the little iodine we do have tends not to be able to even do its job because it is displaced by other environmental toxins as well. There's much we could say about supplements, but look, if it's an area you're interested in, it's worthwhile doing some of your own research because there's a lot out there that can be helpful, subject to your individual needs and requirements. The next thing is sleep. We spoke about that briefly last week. Sleep is important because it's while we sleep, not only do we actually process a lot of information in our brains and consolidate memories and the day's activities, but we detox. In fact, it's while we sleep that the cells in our brain actually shrink and open up channels where the cerebrospinal fluid can flow much more readily and can detox. Because our brains don't have a lymphatic system, but some people, as I mentioned, have called this the glymphatic system. And it's 10 times more effective during sleep. Now, some people asked, well, is it effective during naps as opposed to sleep? Yes, it will be. Whenever there's a time when there's brain downtime, where the brain cells can actually go into a relaxed state or even, I guess, call it a very short hibernation, then there's a possibility that they can actually decrease in size and open up those channels. Now, will that be more during sleep time than nap time? Yes, probably, but it doesn't mean that there's not going to be an effect during nap time. So sleep is something very important. The next one is rest and recreation. It's really quite interesting that sleep we've spoken about, but rest generally. With our busy lives, sometimes things can get so full on, we don't really have time to take a step back. Our bodies are in overdrive all the time. Think about the cortisol that we're generating. It has flow-on effects to the rest of our body in terms of being able to detox and eliminate. And this is why rest and recreation is so important. kind of is really interesting when you reflect on it in terms of when our first parents were first created. The idea was that God didn't say, well, look, you've immediately got to do all this work and it's work, 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 much like our society now. But there was a period of time that on the seventh day, God rested and he gave an example. And so it's something that actually even makes sense today, that there is a downtime where you can actually rest, you can actually be apart from your usual activities to give your body, and as we realise, it gives our bodies a sense to regenerate and to actually improve our health. And this is where recreation is something which is very important, because it's something different that is not our usual stressed out life in the ideal sense. It gives us an opportunity to connect with those who are close to us. It gives us a chance to actually express the positive emotions which we know are so good for health as well. Well, actually leads us to the final point, and that is by having positive emotions, we can detox and have those stronger defences. And this is where the Bible actually tells us a lot about positive emotions. Proverbs chapter 17:22 says, "A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones." Now, that was pretty obvious, thousands of years ago, but look, medicine's finding even more so how relevant that is. Because we didn't have an idea of epigenetics even 20 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago. But what we're finding now is that there are very strong biochemical mechanisms why indeed this is so. And then there's another very good piece of advice that we find in the New Testament in the book of Philippians. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And that's fantastic advice as well, because those are the type of things that I think are going to make a massive positive contribution to our lives in many ways, in all aspects of health. Clearly the spiritual, the social, the mental and the physical. In terms of total health, this is advice very much worth following. Well, thank you, and over to Daniel for question time.